Alright, I'm good to go whenever.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the 3D model of the brain with the use of Play-Doh. The first thing I will be focusing on is the parts on the brainstem, as well as the things surrounding it inside, which is the cerebral cortex. The one thing to mention is the cerebral cortex is important because its function is most important in the complex mental functions, for example, thinking and planning. The brainstem is important in context because it connects the forebrain, the spinal cord, as well as the cerebellum. And this brainstem contains a midbrain, pons, and medulla, which is important with the central activity, which is heart rate, which is specific to the medulla, and breathing, and then sleeping and dreaming, which is closely related to the pons, which is right here. It's also important for automatic function, like automatic survival function, which so essential living, basically. And then the reticular formation, which is right here, is also part of the midbrain, but their main purpose is also in the sleep category, which is the sleep-wake cycle, where it suppresses certain muscle movement when dreaming. As for the back end of the brain, there's the cerebellum, which is to the right of the brainstem, which is right here, and it is responsible for voluntary movement as well as balance. If this part is damaged, you will have severe difficulty in walking as well as staying balanced. The thalamus, which is right up top of the brainstem, which is right here, it's kind of difficult to see, it's the orange, is important with sensory information. And basically it receives all the sensory information, organizes it, and then later on returns it back to the cortex for, looking into it more. It receives all sensory information except for smell. And then the basal ganglia sits up top of the thalamus, and it is important with working with the cerebellum in order for things to be communicated with voluntary movements. The hypothalamus, which is this little pink thing right here, is just below the thalamus, and it is important with controlling movements, with motivated behaviors like eating. And there are two subcategories, being the lateral hypothalamus, which is the one controlling the hunger, and the ventromedial hypothalamus, which controls fullness. The hypothalamus is very important as well because it also controls the pituitary gland, which is the master gland and basically controls everything around the other glands and controls growth. And then the hippocampus, which is this guy right here, I think, is basically used for learning information as well as storing it and then later in turn recalling it. It's attached to the hippocampus is the amygdala, which influences aggression and fear, and it's involved with emotional awareness and expression, which in turn allows for us to recognize expressions of fear and anger in others. Above all is the corpus callosum, which is responsible for connecting the two brain hemispheres and communicating together between the two. Okay, now we're going to move on to this little thing. And this basically contains everything from the cerebral cortex, but breaks it down to like parts. So moving on specifically to the frontal lobe, it contains the Broca's area, which is involved in speech and things like that. But the frontal lobe itself is important with personality, intelligence, and voluntary controls of the muscle. And this is the last part of the brain. This is the last bit of brain that is like in development. It also contains the motor cortex, which is specific to that voluntary movement. And then the parietal lobe is important for processing sensory information that is specific to taste, touch, and temperature. And then the somato, which is right here, which is connected to the parietal, is located, like said, in the parietal lobe and is important in detecting and interpreting these different sensory information. It allows us to perceive size, shape, and texture of certain things that we touch. And then in the back here is the occipital lobe, which is important for processing and responding to visual stimuli. And then the temporal lobe is the sparkly blue Play-Doh bit, is involved in hearing, language processing, as well as memory. And then it also contains the Wernicke's area, which is located, like I said, in the temporal region and is important in understanding speech. That's all.